Hello, friends. I'm excited for today. In a lot of ways, the conversation today is kind of what the dream was for this podcast project, which was true experts in the field of the New Testament and ancient Christianity talking about what we know about the resurrection and the facts around it. So I'm beyond excited to share this wonderful interview with Dr. Michael J. Kruger. He's the president and Samuel C. Patterson Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Reformed Theological Seminary. He's at the Charlotte campus. Say that 3 times fast. He's one of the leading scholars today in the study of the origins of the New Testament, and he's the author of many books, including one that I wrote over the weekend called Surviving Religion 101. As you can imagine, Dr. Kruger's incredible work means he gets to speak all over the world and writes for many publications, including the Wall Street Journal and his own website, Cannon Fodder. He's married to Melissa Kruger, who's Vice President of Discipleship and Programming for the Gospel Coalition, and they have 3 lovely children. Please welcome Dr. Kruger to The Rising. Dr. Kruger, in many ways, this project is designed for people like you who are experts in your field, and you've spent many years studying the New Testament and studying the resurrection. So I'm honored that you're on this podcast.
Well, I'm thrilled to be with you. This should be a fun conversation.
I hope so. So I did read your book over the weekend, Surviving Religion 101. And one thing that interested me is we've talked a lot about, on various guests in this project, we've talked a lot about the evidence for the resurrection, which is, of course, I love. But you also, in sections, talked about the refutations of the resurrection, like what skeptics say, like the rationale that they depend on to contest it. And do you mind walking through quickly what those what the most frequent objections are to whether or not the resurrection happened?
I mean, there's so many, and usually I divide them between sort of philosophical objections and historical objections. And the philosophical are more hidden, and so they're not as obvious, and you have to sort of dig around to know they're there. But one of the things that happens, let's imagine you're in a conversation with somebody about the resurrection. As a Christian, you lay out what you think is a good case for it, and we think it's a good case. But you find very quickly that the person you're talking to doesn't feel like they're persuaded at all.
Yeah.
And you realize, well, are we talking about the same thing here? Why is it that what I look at seems compelling, but you look at the same things and you don't find them compelling? But we tell them about all the evidence for the resurrection. It just falls on deaf ears because already from the outset, they're committed to this idea that just people don't rise from the dead. We don't see miracles. Miracles aren't really things that we really believe take place. And there's sort of this unspoken assumption that miracles are really impossible. So if I hear a historical report about a miracle, it doesn't matter how good the evidence is. It could be the greatest pile of evidence ever. I'm always going to choose the non-supernatural option as opposed to the supernatural option every single time, says the non-Christian, because that's just they're hardwired to do that. So one of the things I deal with when we deal with skeptics to the resurrection is you just leave the evidence aside for a moment. Don't go there yet. Let's talk about big picture worldviews. Why do you believe what you believe about the supernatural and about God and about whether miracles are possible or impossible? And that's a conversation that really has to happen. And what you quickly discover is that the assumption about the impossibility of miracles isn't really built on anything. It's just there. And it's just an assumption. It's not built on evidence. Now, the non-Christian will say, well, I've never seen a miracle, but that's not relevant because there's thousands of testimonies of people who have. So what you realize is a built-in hardwired thing. So that's a really key starting place that I always like to go is, okay, what is it that you already believe that's keeping you from looking at this evidence fairly?
Have you been in conversations where you've been able to bring someone from not believing in miracles fundamentally to believing in them, or at least being open to them? Because wouldn't everyone want to believe that miracles can happen? Like, who wouldn't want to believe that?
So on one level, you're right. I mean, doesn't the average person kind of wish there were miracles? And wouldn't it be great if there were? And don't we have this sort of cultural fascination with the supernatural? But then when you get down to brass tacks and you have to admit that Jesus rose from the dead, suddenly miracles look like they're not possible anymore. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, that comes with a whole slate of implications.
Reading your book, it did make me think. I'm from the Reformed tradition, and I think you might be as well. And I have found that there's a lot of evangelism And this podcast project isn't even about evangelism. I just wanted to study the resurrection as a historical event. But I have noticed that Christians a lot of times will lead with something negative when they're talking to someone who doesn't believe this. Like, oh, can't you sense that there's emptiness? Or can't you sense your own soul is hurting and aching for something more? But reading your book, I thought, man, do we have it wrong? We should be leading with the miracle. Like, we should be leading with, don't you want to live in a world where someone came back from the dead? Like, isn't that a wonderful world you could live in? And you do live in that world. You just don't know it yet.
Let's talk objective history. If Jesus of Nazareth lived and he died and he rose from the dead 3 days later, that changes everything in the universe. There's nothing left the same now. And so you have to reckon with that. And by the way, there's no split in the difference. Either he did or he didn't rise. If he didn't rise, okay, well then the world is, I think, lost in a very dark place. If he did rise, well then there's hope eternal there. And so it's one or the other. And I think putting someone face to face with that fork in the road is a really powerful place to put them. And they have to reckon with choosing between those two options. And I think if they're honest with themselves, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, you're left with a rather meaningless universe. You have things that just happen and they're random and there's no real purpose, no real meaning. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, then that means there's something more in the universe than you and me. And that can be both scary and wonderful at the same time.
Right. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, there's literally no redemption.
Yep.
And no other faith, no other belief system offers any redemption. They might offer some kind of like personal fulfillment in the afterlife, but there's no real redemption for suffering.
Yeah. And what you realize about the resurrection is that fundamentally, and people don't really think of it this way because we're talking about it in more historical evidences categories, which is great. And those are important categories. But what people don't realize about the resurrection in terms of its importance is it really is the first step towards solving what we call the problem of evil. The problem of evil in the world is, what do we do with all the death and suffering and pain in the world? How do we accommodate that in a world with a divine being, with a God? In Christianity, I think it's the only religion that gives an answer to that, because that very God suffered under that world and bore death for us, and in one sense takes the first step towards solving it, and eventually will solve it fully when he returns. And so what you realize, and what's so hopeful about the resurrection, is it tells you there is a solution to the problem of evil in the world. There is something that God has done to deal with death, and people want to know that.
One thing that's super compelling to me is that there were other people in the ancient world who proclaimed themselves the Messiah and had followers, and there were other messianic movements contemporary to Jesus. But they all died out. So like that messianic figure died and the movement died with them. And I've heard that reference several times, including in your book. Do we know anything about those other messianic movements?
So one of the most famous is, of course, Judas Maccabees, who came before Jesus. And then what's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt after Jesus, both built around would-be messiahs. But the same principle applies, which is that, would-be messiahs work in most people's minds as long as they are alive. But once they're dead, then they clearly are not the messiah you thought they were. And one of the reasons this is such an important piece of the puzzle for people's understanding is that there's this belief out there. I don't know really where this comes from, but it's very much a thought people have that the earliest Christians after Jesus died were sort of really eager to see him alive. Or that the earliest Christians, once Jesus died, and his 12 disciples, or 11, I guess at that point, were just, about to see Jesus behind every tree and under every rock, and they had this inclination to think that maybe he had risen from the dead. So this is the best explanation people come up with, is that, well, yeah, they wanted to see Jesus rise from the dead, so they had an hallucination, or they had a vision, or what have you.
They were biased. They were biased beyond their own control, their own rationale.
That's right. But all the evidence, we're talking all the evidence, both circumstantially, historically, in the Gospels, is the exact opposite of that. If you look at the Gospel narratives, everything the disciples are doing after Jesus is dead show you they've cashed in their chips. It's over. There's no saving this. This is done. They're thinking about saving their own skins now. They realize, okay, so that went down in flames, and we're just now hiding in the upper room to try to hope that we don't get arrested ourselves. And then when you compare to the historical examples of the other would-be messiahs, when their messiah was killed, that movement ended. And you think about it, even in that posture, when the women came to the door and said, hey, we the tomb's empty, you realize the disciples weren't like, yeah, we knew that was going to happen, and sure, we've been waiting for this. No, they're like, they still are hesitant. They still don't want to believe. And so what you realize is one of the greatest evidences for the resurrection is how in the world would the early Christian movement have ever survived? It's death of its Savior. Why would it continue? Why would it even exist? The fact that the church exists at all in those early centuries and continued on is an anomaly and an historical fact that deserves an historical explanation. And I would say to somebody, regardless of what you think about God or the existence of God or the Bible, you have to explain that. You have to explain how Christians got from completely demoralized and defeated and with no hope at all to suddenly, overnight, basically thinking that everything's been completely reversed. What explains that reversal? And of course, as Christians, we think the only plausible explanation is the resurrection. But the non-Christian still has to come up with an answer, and I think that's really, really hard to do. Like one scholar very famously, a guy by the name of Herman Ramara, said, well, the disciples stole the body and made up the resurrection, okay? And that's why Christians began to believe in it. But you just back up the question, what would motivate the disciples to steal the body? They're not thinking about stealing a body. They're thinking about saving their own skin. So we got to believe that these people who've just lost their Messiah get in an upper room somewhere and say, hey, I got a great idea. Let's go stir up a hornet's nest by going down to the tomb and fighting off a Roman guard and stealing the body. And then we'll walk around and talk about it all the time. That'll be great. That's a great idea. Okay, that's just not historically plausible.
The same Roman guards, by the way, who had just murdered Jesus, tortured him, and the disciples fled the scene.
It's just totally implausible. And then there's another German scholar by the name of Paulus who came up with this idea that, okay, well, maybe we can explain this by the fact that when Jesus was put in the tomb, he wasn't actually dead, that he had only passed out. This is called the swoon theory of the resurrection. So the idea that you just sort of, no one knew how to evaluate dead people in the ancient world. So you'd pass out and they think you're dead, they bury you and you come back. And that sparked this sense of a resurrection. But that theory has been routinely rejected on so many levels. The idea that you could survive this is crazy, the beating that Jesus took. But even if you did survive it, you're wrapped up in linens in a tomb. How are you getting out half dead? How are you going to get out of the linens and get out of the tomb? And even if you did all that, your appearance to your disciples isn't going to convince them you're the Son of God. You're going to be a half dead guy crawling back for help. Brutally injured. And then the only explanation that's really left, and the one that most scholars use now, is the hallucination theory, that they saw a vision of Jesus risen from the dead. But we know that just seeing visions doesn't necessarily compel you that Jesus is alive. I mean, you when Jesus appeared to his disciples, they needed to physically touch him. They needed to physically eat with him to be convinced. For that matter, beyond all this, hallucinations by definition don't happen in groups.
I mean, we can't deny that the gospel accounts are fundamental to knowing whether or not this happened. You talk about the credibility of the Gospels and also about how their titles, like the fact that we have intact titles for the Gospel letters, lends to their verifiability. Walk us through why they're credible.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, most of what we've been talking about regarding the resurrection and its circumstances and situation and what we know and don't know about Jesus' burial all comes from the Gospels. So the question of their historicity is really key, right, to this whole discussion. So obviously, if you're going to get back to the person of Jesus, there's a handful of people you want to get into if you're going to know something about Jesus, both in terms of access and trustworthiness. And that is, of course, his original followers who were eyewitnesses of these things and would have been there. So we would ask the question, gee, if I had a gospel, wouldn't I want a gospel that goes back to one of Jesus's original followers? That'd be pretty good, right? I mean, if I'm choosing between a gospel that who knows who wrote it, and I'm choosing between that gospel and a gospel that was written by one of Jesus's best friends who was there when all this happened, golly, I think I know which one I would choose, right? I would probably go with the one that was written by his best friend who was actually an eyewitness and was present for these things. Okay, so that's what we desire in a gospel. Do we have that in our gospels? Well, actually, we do. We have two gospels that are titled that go back to Matthew and John, which we know are part of the 12. And we know Mark's gospel, for historical reasons, goes back to the person of Peter. So people don't realize this, but Mark is, the early church widely understood Mark to just be funneling the reminiscences of Peter. And so effectively, Mark's gospel is Peter's gospel. And Luke's very similar to this. Luke tells us in his prologue that that he relied on those who were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word from the very beginning for his material. In other words, he is himself not an apostle, but what you have in his gospel is effectively the apostolic testimony. So in all four gospels, we have reasons to think these go back to Jesus' original followers. Every document of history, almost inevitably, we don't have the original version of, you have handwritten copies of. So that's just normal par for the course when you're dealing with something 2,000 years old. The question is, how far back do our copies go? And we have a good number of copies that date all the way to the 2nd century, many of which are of John, interestingly, despite the fact that he was one of the last books written in the New Testament. And so we go back remarkably close to when the original authors wrote. That gap of time then, let's say Mark wrote in 90 AD, and we have a copy of Mark, let's say, from 150 AD, so we're looking at, 60 years, is so micro. You have to understand, in the world of ancient manuscripts, that is, everybody would do cartwheels if we could have that kind of gap in most documents. Most documents, the standard gap for a document 2,000 years old is probably about 1,000 years. It's not unusual to have a document from the 1st century in our earliest copies, 10th century. That's not unusual. But in the New Testament, we have so much better and so much earlier copies.
One thing that I thought was interesting in your book was that, other religions will acknowledge, they'll say Jesus was a prophet, right? Jesus was a prophet. Jesus was a teacher. But then it's almost like a secondary way of acknowledging that the resurrection happened, because so much of Jesus's prophecy was about his own resurrection. So if another belief system is saying, well, Jesus was a great prophet, well, what he prophesied was his coming back from the dead and reigning. So if you're going to if you're going to acknowledge he's a prophet, you've got to acknowledge the prophecies were true.
I think you're on the right track there. Their answer to that, though, is that's not been that fact you just raised has not been lost on Muslims, let's say, who believe that Jesus is a prophet. So they think that yes, Jesus is a prophet, but these records that you have are corrupted. And so they're going to argue that the Gospels that tell about Jesus predicting his own resurrection are corrupted. So you're not getting the full story or the correct story, they would argue. So they're able to retain this, Jesus is a great moral teacher, but don't believe everything you read in the Gospels at the same time. Now, the idea that the Gospels are corrupted beyond repair is simply not tenable historically. And people, including myself, have written on this extensively and said, no, actually our Gospels are really well maintained.
Dr. Kruger, when you read the resurrection narratives, you personally, is there a moment in the resurrection that kind of draws you in more than the others? Considering how much of the Bible actually is about the resurrection, we don't get that many chapters that describe Jesus' resurrected life. But is there one that you are drawn to more than the others?
There's a number of facts about the resurrection that stand out to me. And they're splattered across several of the gospel accounts of the resurrection. One is the degree to which they don't recognize Jesus right away when he's risen from the dead. And this goes back to my earlier point, as if they so expected Jesus to rise from the dead that they were seeing visions of him, and no, they saw they were standing right there, and that didn't even dawn on them that they were talking to Jesus. These people were not expecting the resurrection. And you think about the story of Luke of the disciples on the road to Emmaus who Jesus comes along and starts talking to. Such a fascinating story, and Luke even mentions one of their names. So there's a very personalness here to this in these resurrection accounts. And in fact, scholars have argued that a lot of the names we find in the Gospels are probably there, not just to offer color to the story. They're there to probably tip the reader to the person who was the source of the story. They're the eyewitness that gives you that story.
Yeah, these were contemporaries.
Yeah.
So you could be like, oh, go talk to so-and-so.
Yeah,
like I'm talking about so-and-so. Right.
And so I think that's, one of the things. The other part that I think strikes me in the resurrection accounts is one of the things that's unique to the Gospel of Mark, where they get to the tomb's empty, the angel's there, and the angel says, he's risen, he'll meet you in Galilee, go tell the disciples. And then the angel says, go tell the disciples and Peter. And you're like, whoa, that's
right.
interesting.
That's right.
And only Mark does this. And what's interesting about it is, isn't Peter one of the 12? Why do you have to add and Peter? I think there's a couple layers there that are fascinating. One is, I think, undoubtedly, Jesus is commissioning this angel to tell him, I'm going to meet up with you. And no doubt, he's like, and tell Peter it's going to be okay, right?
Oh,
After
that gives me a chill. That gives
after
me a
all
chill.
that happened, right? I'm gonna
Yes.
call out Peter's defeat here and sort of personalize it to him and say, oh, and tell Peter it's going to be fine. I'm alive, and if he's alive, then it's fine. The other layer to it, though, isn't just that it's a personal sort of pastoral touch to Peter, but scholars have pointed out that Peter is effectively the main character in Mark's gospel. The first disciple you meet is Peter, and the last disciple mentioned is Peter. This sort of bookends the entire gospel around Peter, and it confirms what I said earlier, is that Mark's gospel is Peter's gospel. And you have internal linguistic clues that are sort of telling the reader that when you're reading this gospel, yeah, Mark's the author, technically, fair enough, but you're getting Peter here. And I think what that does is it reminds you yet again that you're going as far back as you can go here to the sources. You can't get further back than that. And Peter was there for all this. And if you're getting Peter's gospel, there's great reasons to trust that you're getting something that's accurate.
And just to be clear, so the listener understands, it's Mark's gospel, but Mark is reporting things Peter said. When you say it's Mark's, it's not Peter's gospel, it's Mark's gospel, but just explain what you mean by that a little more.
So when we talk about it being Mark's gospel, what we mean is that he wrote it, right? It's his work. So he's the author. Okay, we could say in a sense he's the one holding the pen, although technically he used a scribe. Okay, but he's technically the one who wrote it all down. But authors have sources. Okay, and so whenever you read an author, you're like, well, why should I trust you? You weren't there, Mark. Mark wasn't an eyewitness. Yeah,
it's reporting.
Why should I think you? Why should I listen to you? And the evidence from front to back historically is that Mark is relaying Peter's own accounts. So Peter is the source behind Mark, and there's all kinds of both internal and external evidence to support that. And so Mark's the author, but Peter's the source, you could say. Now, what I think is remarkable here is that was a widespread belief in early Christianity. Everyone sort of understood this. Can you imagine the temptation of calling Mark's gospel the gospel of Peter? I mean, who was Mark anyway? Fairly anonymous, fairly
I
no
think
name.
I'd be inclined to call it the gospel of Peter.
Right. You would just start calling it the gospel of Peter, but it never happens. What's interesting is that there is this I think is a sign of authenticity, that all the momentum would have been just call it the gospel of Peter, but it retains Mark as author, and it shows you that these early Christians weren't just going to attach titles willy-nilly. He really was the author. But at the same time, it's understood that Peter's the source behind it.
Like tell the absolute truth, like a commitment to the absolute truth. Yeah,
but you'll notice that in John's gospel, when they come and get an announcement that the tomb is empty, it's Peter that runs along with John to the tomb. And you can imagine that of all the disciples who were maybe most eager to figure out whether something special had happened, Peter would have been the one that would have wanted to know. And we're told in John's gospel that even though John beat him to the tomb, when Peter, he stayed on the outside and Peter just rushed in, to this empty tomb, which fits perfectly with his personality, we might add. And then it says in John's gospel that he saw the linens lying there and believed. And that's interesting language, because in the ancient world, and this is another confirmatory of the resurrection, in the ancient world, grave robbers was common. People would rob graves all the time, which is why you put a big stone in front of the grave, right? Keep people from robbing.
Why would they rob graves? Because was there jewelry, or like what was the point of that? Yeah,
well, in ancient Palestine, they would rob the graves mainly to get the grave clothes. So the linens that wrap a corpse are very expensive, and these linens were worth stealing. And so if you were a grave robber, you would take the linen and leave the body. But now you have the linen just lying there and no body. How does a body get out of its linens? And the way that John describes it almost looks like the linens may be laying in the shape of a body. It's not in the corner in a pile, as if someone unwrapped the body and took the body, although there's no explanation for why they would do that. So what you have is you have the linens there where the body would be, but no body. And it says that Peter looked in that and believed. And I think there's a number of things about that are really confirmatory historically. One is that is very accurate to what we know about tombs in the ancient world. And it's totally explainable why seeing that you would believe in the resurrection, because that's not what you would see if someone had taken the body.
Like obvious there's no body. So it's like the person literally passed through whatever.
That's right. We don't know.
He was wrapped in.
Exactly what it looked like, but it apparently laid in such a shape that he thought that is not explainable in any
in a natural way.
And it confirmed his belief in the resurrection. So yeah, it seems to have suggested that, well, there's two linens, right? There's the head part and there's the body part, and they were laying in conjunction with each other, which suggests they were laying in the shape of a body, but no body's there. And I think that's where you're faced with, oh wow, this is a sign that he's risen.
Wow. Dr. Kruger, this was so fun. I want to come take your class. Please tell listeners if they want to know more about your work and follow along, how can they find you in the best way?
Yeah, so I teach at Reformed Theological Seminary, of course, and I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina. But my website is probably the best way for people to track up with what I'm doing, where I put a lot of my work on my website, post articles regularly, and link to interviews and lectures I give and things like that. So my website is michaeljkruger.com. You can reach out to me there. You can see my speaking schedule if you want to hear me speak. And obviously, if you want to take a class, you can do it either in person at one of our RTS campuses, and we also have online classes, and I teach those too.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Rising podcast as we look further into the resurrection of Jesus. Did you know The Rising is also an album? The Rising is an album that I wrote that tells the story of Christ's resurrection. Each song on the album is written from a different perspective of someone who was actually there at the resurrection. Each guest on The Rising also has a perspective. And you know what? So do you. I would venture to say that your perspective is the one that I'm most interested in. Would so love it if you'd subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and you can find new episodes on any of those platforms as well. If you want to get to know me better, you can find me on Instagram or go to melaniepenn.com and you can send me a message there. I make things for you, and I'm so glad that you are here for The Rising.